Memory errors, when you say you remember something but you're wrong, that is usually related to retrieval, or to put it another way, it is related to reconstruction. If you're not paying attention to an event when it happens, you can't store it, you can't retrieve it later. What can happen though, is you can reconstruct or create memories even if they're not there. And so the output from that process is almost certainly not a reliable memory. It's certainly not one reliable enough to be the basis for criminal charges. Duration of the event. It's not just how long was the crime, but how long did the witness actually have an opportunity to see the person that they're going to identify.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another Justia webinar. My name is Nina, and I'll be the moderator for today. Now, to kick things off, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker, Dr. Terrell. Since 2010, Dr. Terrell has consulted and testified in criminal cases involving memory. Today, he is a nationwide expert focusing on eyewitness identification cases, cases involving delayed outcries and sexual assaults, and other cases in which witnesses' recollections of events are in question. As of May 2025, he has consulted on over 300 cases and testified in over 50, including death penalty murder cases and appeals overseen by the Innocence Project of Texas. The webinar presentation which you're about to watch will be approximately 1 hour, and Trent will be taking questions from the audience towards the end of the presentation, time permitting. So if you've got questions that you'd like us to take towards the end of the presentation, please be sure to submit those by clicking the Q&A button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen and sending them in there. Now, without further ado, here is Dr. Trent Terrell to discuss spotting the flaws, how to scientifically challenge eyewitness identification.
All right, thanks very much for the introduction. I appreciate it. As you said, I've been doing these types of cases for nearly 20 years now. That's one of the first types of cases I started doing. So I have a lot of experience with these identification cases. Anytime I do a CLE, one of the first things I like to say about myself, and you'll figure this out quickly enough, I'm not an attorney. I am a psychologist. But more importantly, I'm a clinical psychologist. I am not the type that sees clients or does assessments or makes determinations about who is sane or who is not. In fact, when I work on criminal cases, I don't even ever talk to the witnesses I'm interacting with. I am a researcher, and so when I come into the courtroom or work with you on a case, I am simply explaining to you or the jury how memory works and how it doesn't. And specifically in this area, kind of getting into this cottage industry that is research on eyewitness identifications. There have been tens of thousands, most likely at least thousands, probably tens of thousands of studies looking into how eyewitnesses make decisions. So unlike some of the other areas we can get into, there is a great deal of research that looks specifically at how these decisions are made. So if you have a case like this, I would love to meet with you or talk to you. You can see my website there and my email address. Feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to discuss these more. Here we go. Here's what we're going to cover today. I am going to talk about a murder case I worked on a few years ago that really sort of highlights some of the things I'll be talking about. It does make it easier to see how this stuff actually applies real world. And then kind of the nuts and bolts of what we're going to do today is look at all of the different factors that have been empirically demonstrated to impact the reliability of decisions in these cases. We're also going to do a quick overview of how memory works and how it doesn't, just very quickly. And then we'll get into some photospreads, which is what a lot of this comes down to. It's analyzing those photospreads that are used to make these decisions. And I'll relate those to some cases that I've worked on over the last few years in Texas. All right, so just to kind of summarize this case that I worked on back in 2017, this was a murder case. I'll run through the synopsis with you here briefly. I will tell you one of the reasons I like to use this one as an example is the context with which the attorney reached out to me. She called me and really wasn't sure how to approach her case at all, but said that she did suspect there were a lot of problems and she kind of just couldn't wrap her mind around how to approach it. The problem with her case was that it happened in a very public place. It happened in sort of the kind of yard area of an apartment complex where a birthday party was going on, and there were 40 to 50 people around when this happened. in broad daylight. So multiple people saw it. 3 different witnesses identified her client. They all knew who he was and had seen him around previously. All 3 of them testified in the case. And she said, how am I supposed to approach this case where all these people saw him do it? They all knew who he was before. What am I supposed to do despite the fact that I have this sense that things are just not adding up? So it's going to be a good kind of opportunity to explain all the things that we can get into. So here's kind of the setup. Here's the diagram of the apartment complex where this happened. So what happened is the shooter pulled into this parking lot, made a big circle around it, ended up parking there facing the party. So the black car is where the shooter was. The red circle is where the victim was shot. So he actually beckoned him over to the car, like, hey, man, come here, I want to talk to you, and shot him right there by the car. So one of the witnesses' cars was parked right behind this car. And in fact, she had walked past the driver's side window to get to the party prior to this shooting happening. So she was walked right past him. And you can see the 3 blue circles are where the testifying witnesses were when the shooting took place. So that's fairly daunting given, the broad daylight and the close range. And so this is what she was up against. But she did note several inconsistencies, things that kind of stood out to her that gave her this idea that maybe there was something here to work with. There was debate about exactly what kind of car it was. Some called it a black Charger, some called it a black Challenger, others said it was a white Charger. Now, confusing Charger and Challenger could happen, but black versus white, that's a little bit more noticeable. Some said the car had red stripes on it, some said it didn't. Some said the shooter had long black dreads. Some said he had short hair. That's an obvious inconsistency. Some said there was a passenger in the passenger seat. Some said there weren't. So it's like they had seen this, but at the same time, they were missing, or at least were inconsistent on a lot of the details. So she called me up and said, how do I do this? How do I start to make this case that maybe they didn't see this as well as they thought they did? Well, I'm going to tell y'all what I told her. We're going to work through all the factors that are involved and show how we can work up this case. So as I said, this initially was a hung jury, and then it actually got thrown out mid-trial the second time. But she did tell me post, jury interview that my testimony was pretty helpful in kind of setting up the doubt that she was trying to create. So we'll talk about how we did that. Now, I do want to mention briefly what the foundation for any of my testimony is, and it's basically putting in front of the jury the idea that human memory is not reliable. Now, a couple months ago, I did an entire presentation for Justia on how human memory works and how it doesn't. I'll reference that for y'all if you want more information. I think it's on YouTube. Feel free to go find that. But I spent an hour kind of doing a mini college course on how human memory works. Here today, I'm going to just sort of summarize that for you. And that becomes really relevant because typically when you're in a criminal trial, you don't have an hour to teach the jury about memory. So it comes down to how do you very quickly establish the frailty of human memory in about 5 minutes. It can be very tricky to do. So I like to start, or at least reference, this quote by Elizabeth Loftus. Loftus is one of the foremost memory researchers in the United States. She has been for some time. About 10 or 15 years ago, she put this quote in a paper where she said, essentially all memory is false to some degree. Now, that seems like a really big statement. It seems too far-reaching. It's like, how could that be possible? But what she's saying is that all memories are dependent on this process of reconstruction. What it means is that when we experience an event, we are not forming a videotape of it. We are not storing every single detail in a filing cabinet to be played back and experienced in verbatim accuracy later on. When we experience a memory, we must actually rebuild it. We rebuild it in the moment. And each time we do that, the possibility exists that it will change or it will be different. So therefore, anytime we experience a memory, it is dependent on this process. There's the opportunity for rebuilding the information incorrectly. What do we rebuild it with? Well, context, assumptions, expectations, what most likely happened or what would have made sense to happen. Often we take in information we've gained from other sources. And so this explains how witness statements can in fact change over time. Maybe they've heard information here, maybe they've talked to this person there. And maybe where they end up is in fact different from where they started. So just getting in front of your jury this idea that memory is not a set of videotapes. It is not a verbatim factual storing of what happened. We do not have the attentional capacity as events are happening to take in every single detail. Our eyes are not video cameras. It depends on what we're paying attention to and other things that might be distracting us and other things we're thinking about. Even if we did have that capacity, we don't have the storage room to just have row after row after row of filing cabinets of videotapes of events from our life. If we did, our brains would get full. We would run out of storage the way our phones do. That never happens. We have the ability to remember our entire lives, more or less. And the reason we can do that is because we sacrifice accuracy for scale. We can remember everything pretty well, but we can't remember anything perfectly. So there is no magic ability to just say, today, for this particular important instance, we're going to treat this memory as if it were perfect. So getting that idea in front of the jury to start with is difficult. It's almost like Mythbusters. It's hard to come in and dissuade people who think their memories work better than they probably do, to get them to accept that in a few minutes, but you have to try. So this quote is a good foundation for that. Now, there is research about whether or not people actually already know this or not. The research will show you that about 2/3 of your jury will probably assume that it does work like a video camera. We've surveyed lots and lots of people, and it is just sort of a misnomer that this is how memory actually works. And therefore, about 55% of people believe that once a memory is formed, it doesn't change. Like once you've got this process of building it or reconstructing it or saving it, whatever you want to call it, once it's finished, it's finished. And then every time you take out the memory, it'll be like looking at a photo album. It'll stay the same each time. Well, 0% of people like me agree with that. Any memory researcher, or really any psychologist who understands memory at all, would tell you that that's not true. But your jurors, probably half of them, at least believe or kind of believe that memory works much better than it does. So convincing them that that's not true is the goal. Sometimes it helps to talk about what memory's not. That's what we just did. It's not a video recorder. It also helps to talk about what memory is. So there are 3 basic things that has to happen before we can say a long-term memory has taken place. Those are encoding, storage or consolidation, and retrieval. Encoding is paying attention to the event while it's happening. It's seeing it with your eyes, hearing it with your ears, getting the information from the environment into your brain so that it has a chance to be processed. Storage and consolidation is doing just that. It is processing it in some way, storing as much of the event as you can so that it can be accessed at a later time. And then retrieval is finding access to that, and it really is the process of reconstruction. It's taking whatever has been stored and then flourishing it with assumptions and context and just filling in all the gaps so that you can have a complete memory. When I ask people, everyday people, college students, whoever, which of these 3 they think is most important, almost invariably, most people say retrieval. They think that's the most important part of memory. And for most people, that's when memory starts. It's like, well, let me go find this. I know it's in here somewhere. Okay, here it is. That's what they seem to think is most important. I'll tell you which one's most important, and maybe you can figure it out based on what I've already said. It's encoding. If you're not paying attention to an event when it happens, you can't store it, you can't retrieve it later. If you're distracted, if something's too far away, if it's too dark, and these are the things we're going to get into with these ID cases, then it's not really possible to even get to the next 2 steps. What can happen, though, is you can reconstruct or create memories even if they're not there. Or if you have a slight fuzzy memory, you can use a reconstructive process to turn it into something that is more vivid, that seems more complete. This process is not finding information in your brain, and that's how a lot of people think about it. It's in there. I just have to find it. I just have to think about it, and then it'll come to me. It's not locating it. It is creating it. And so the output from that process is almost certainly not a reliable memory. It's certainly not one reliable enough to be the basis for criminal charges. So that's the idea you've got to put in front of your jury. So most memory failures, which would be, I don't remember at all, that's usually a problem with encoding or with storage. And when someone says, I don't know, or I don't remember, that doesn't really hurt the judicial process. There's no risk or threat in that. But memory errors, when you say you remember something, but you're wrong, that is usually related to retrieval, or to put it another way, it is related to reconstruction. So you are challenging the idea in your jurors that just because they remember it doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean they've successfully located it, and therefore it must be true. The reconstructive process can happen for incomplete memories, partially complete memories. It is the same thing. And so what you end up with may not be perfect. So succinct generalizations. How do you kind of tie all this together? A good thing I like to say is memory is imperfect even when it works perfectly. Our system is not designed to make videotapes or computer files that store verbatim accounts of what happened. If it did, we would run out of space and we would be bogged down with useless information. So our memory is never supposed to be perfect in any context. What it is an elaborate system of forgetting and reassembling as necessary. And this is actually a very elegant solution. We experience our days. All sorts of stuff happens. Most of it is not that relevant or important. We are able to let it kind of fade away. But if it becomes important later, we can then rebuild it. We can use all of the tools we have at our disposal to build that back up. And it is probably more or less pretty close to right. But is it factual? Is it perfect? No. So this is great for everyday life. It is bad if suddenly you need to come in and offer factual testimony as an identifying witness, because there's always a chance that your reconstruction is not correct. Ultimately, I'm not talking about lying. Credible witnesses who are telling the truth can be mistaken because the research suggests that false memories feel subjectively just as real as true memories. So when you're done with this process of reconstruction, what you end up with feels exactly the same as a memory that is probably true. Another way to put this is that this reconstructive process, this process of building and assembling and using context, is not really done consciously. It is not done with effort. Very rarely do we say, okay, hold on, I got to think about this. I have to put all these pieces together. It just happens. It happens without intent. And because it happens without intent, we don't realize we're doing it. And we have a tendency to assume that the memories we're experiencing are just factually true. This is somewhat a part of human nature because I've been studying this for 20 years. I still do the same thing. I still have the same subjective belief that what I'm remembering must be what happened. So it's a very hard thing to challenge in people. Really, the only way to do it is to show evidence of how much and how frequently people make mistakes. And that's what the research will do for you. So it's hard to organize this into 15 minutes of Q&A in a direct exam. I teach a cognitive psych course every semester. It takes about 3 months of talking about this stuff for students to truly get it, to truly understand it, because they're going to push back on the idea and they're going to hold that, okay, I get what you're saying in general, but there must be exceptions. There must be times when memory does work perfectly, right? Wrong. There's actually not. There is always the risk that memories are false, incomplete, not 100% reliable. So that's the general takeaway. And Nina mentioned I do delayed outcry cases of sexual abuse. It's the same thing there. You're kind of veering off in different directions. It's different types of research, but that is going to be the foundation for any memory case. Is just trying to sell the jury on this idea that this system that we're relying on was never designed to be perfect in the first place. All right, so we'll branch off into the ID direction. As I said, we could go into outcries here. We could go into any number of different things, but today I want to specifically focus on the research that simulates ID cases. And so we have, with this research, honed in on a list of specific factors that are going to reliably diminish the accuracy of identification. So if you have any of these things present in your case, you can say with empirical confidence that the identification is less reliable than it would have been if that thing was not present. So where does this come from? We've been doing this for over 50 years now. The first was back in 1972. We showed participants a video of two cars crashing together. We asked them questions about what happened afterwards. We saw just how inaccurate they were, how many little mistakes they've made. And so thousands of studies have done similar things where the goal was subsequently to identify the person who was present committing the crime. So we do use videos. We very, very rarely do live action type things because if you do live action, everyone's looking from a different perspective around them. But in a video, everyone's going to sit in front of the screen. Everyone's going to see the same thing. Everyone's going to have exactly the same exposure of everyone else. results, and you have perfect control of what you're showing them. So almost all of these come from videotaped simulated crimes. They're usually 20, 30, 40 seconds long, depending on whichever one you happen to be doing. They watch the crime, you let some time pass, and then you build a photo spread and ask them to pick the person who committed the crime. Every single thing we're going to get into today has come out of these types of experiments and has been replicated so many times that they're really not even up for debate. Everyone just accepts that these factors are 100% relevant to diminishing the reliability of identifications. So there's two different classes of variables that can be focused on. The first are estimator variables, and these just have to do with basically the circumstances of what happened in the case. What time was it? How far away was the person? Had they been drinking? That sort of stuff. By and large, these are outside the control of the judicial system. It's just what happened. And so we call them estimator variables because typically in any given situation, we can only estimate the extent to which it would have mattered. So it was dark. Okay, how dark was it really? Was it so dark that you couldn't see, or could you kind of see? We're not sure. We have to estimate. How stressed did that person get? Were they a little stressed or a lot stressed? So we don't really know for sure the extent to which this factor would have kicked in, but we can simply say that if it did, or if it was present, it would have diminished reliability. So we estimate impact in that regard. System variables, on the other hand, relate to law enforcement procedures by and large. How are questions asked? How are photo spreads put together? What instructions are given to witnesses? Those sorts of things. And so we call them system variables because by and large, they can be controlled. All of this is after the crime is over. So this gets into policies and procedures more than anything. A majority of the research has been on this simply because the goal is to try to make the system better, to try to find things we can do to make identifications more reliable. So that's kind of where people have gravitated towards in terms of research. I think, though, in terms of real world crime, it is the estimator variables that are almost always more important. And there's a little bit less inertia and research behind those just because we figured those out very quickly. They're kind of common sense when you think about them. So the field kind of gravitated away from those. But in terms of impacting a case, I think they should be the thing that you talk most about. So understanding the estimator variables, as I said, is usually just figuring out what happened in the case. Let me see the timing of this and what time of day it was and lighting and that sort of stuff. So we will go through the big factors here. The first is duration of the event. How long was the crime? How long did it take the crime to play out? But more importantly, it's not just how long was the crime, but how long did the witness actually have an opportunity to see the person that they're going to identify? So this is a classic estimator variable because typically you have to ask the witness, how long did this take? And they will have to give you a guess about that. Usually they will overestimate quite a bit. The first case I ever worked was a carjacking. Guy came up behind someone, scuffled with her briefly, took her keys, pushed her down, and stole her car. She was asked how long the encounter took, and she said, well, it couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. To which I said, no, it couldn't have been. You're right. But that was the best estimate we had. And so obviously it was less than 5 minutes. It was probably on the order of 5 to 10 seconds, but we don't know exactly how long it was. But what the research clearly shows, though, is that the shorter the exposure, the less reliable the identification. And that really shouldn't be a surprise at all. Mimon in 2003 took 2 edits of the same video. One of them was 45 seconds. The other was 12. Same video. They just trimmed the second one down so that it didn't last as long. And the correct percentage of ID went from 90% to 32% based on that shortening of time. So it certainly makes sense. The less time you have to study the information you're going to have to learn later, the less reliable the identification is. I like to pause here just to kind of caution everyone so that you don't think, well, if you have a 45-second exposure, it's a 90% chance the ID is right. That's the wrong takeaway because it really does depend on all the other factors. If I have a 45-second exposure to something that's happening a mile away, I can look at that all day and not make a reliable ID. If I have a 45-second exposure to something happening in pitch darkness, doesn't matter. So don't get caught up on the actual percentages here. What we're looking for in these studies is that when you change something, you see this group did this well and this group over here did a lot less. We're looking at just taking down baseline identifications from one percentage to another. But it would be kind of risky to say, well, they had a 45-second exposure. It has to be 90% accuracy, right? That's not true. Every single identification case is different. Every experiment is different. And so it would be wrong to kind of say they all fit, one place or another. So all events are unique. All research studies are unique. So look at drops and percentages, not literal percentages. Another of the most important ones and one of the most basic findings in our field is latency. How much time passes between when this crime took place and when the identification takes place. Now, this has been documented for over 100 years, that as time passes, memories for things decays. So this is really not surprising at all. The more time that goes by, the less reliable the identification will be. This is from 1885, the idea that the rate of correct memory will drop very, very quickly as time passes. This is called the forgetting curve, and it is the amount of information remembered at a short amount of time, spread out over hours and days and months. And so what you take away from this, and research has shown that this is true for just about anything. This is actually remembering words, but it's true for about any type of information you can try to retain. Most of what you're going to forget within the first hour. You see the drop off to 40% there is in an hour. And then it gradually kind of tapers off. But once you get to about 24 hours later, most of the forgetting you're going to do has already taken place. Realistically, most of the forgetting that's going to take place happens within the first hour. And so if you've done an identification case, you're going to get past an hour. If you have a photo spread case, the fastest you're going to get a lineup put together is probably in 24 hours. More realistically, it's going to take weeks or months before you get to this point. But in any case that has a photo spread, it's going to take enough time so that considerable forgetting will take place. And so latency is going to end up being a factor in any identification case. One instance where it might not be is in a field ID. I'm not really specifically getting into field IDs today, but those do still happen, and the goal for doing a field ID is to get this done before the forgetting takes place. But you can see even in the first 20 to 30 minutes, you're almost half forgotten. So the justification for doing field IDs is weak at best because of how suggestive they are, but it is to try to beat this, to try to get this decision made before the memory fades away quickly. But it is simply going to be a factor in any case. I did a study of my own recently where one of the things you do is you put together your crime and your photo spread, and you want to make sure that the photo spread works, that the video works, that people actually have a chance to see what they're supposed to see. And so you take a small control group, you show them the video, and you immediately, with no delay at all, show them the photo spread so they can make a decision. And when I did that, about 90% of my participants got it right. The delay in my experiment was about 15 minutes. So going from that 90% point to 15 minutes later, the correct rate of identification across the study was below 50%. So in just 15 minutes, you're going from just about everyone can do it to less than half of the participants can do it. So you cannot understress this. It is the most important factor really in any case, just how quickly these recollections for things will fade away. So if you have short duration of exposure and you have a long latency, you are halfway there to already establishing a great absence of reliability. So those are the big two in any case. Now, the others that are talked about a lot, stress. We all understand the impact of stress. It's going to lead to sympathetic activation, autonomic arousal, fight or flight instincts, whatever you want to call it. It's hard to study this experimentally because we can't stress out our participants just to see what happens. We can't simulate armed robberies just to see what happens. So by and large, we have to rely on situations where stress is already present. So Morgan et al. In 2004 actually took advantage of some soldiers who were going through survival training. And part of that training is that they would be kind of simulated to be captured and interrogated and threatened with harm with weapons and this whole thing. So half of those participants were put in a high stress situation with an interrogator. The other half of the participants spent the same amount of time with the same guy, sort of just talking, but there was no threat of injury. There wasn't really an intense thing at all. And then the next day, both groups were asked to pick the person who interrogated them out of a photo spread. The group that was threatened in the high stress condition was about 50% less likely to make a correct identification compared to the people who weren't stressed. So this absolutely is something that holds up. It's been tested in some other ways as well. But when you're in a high level of stress, one of the things that happens is the adrenaline and the cortisol and the stress and all the hormones being pumped through your system, they actually shut down the part of your brain that pays attention to what you're doing. It's called the prefrontal cortex. It thinks about the consequences of what you're doing. It says, hey, wait, let's make sure we're doing the right thing before we actually sign off on this action and follow it through. This is necessary for fight or flight because often we don't fight people. Often we don't run away. Our mind will stop us and say, this is not the right thing to do. In instances where survival is necessary, you turn off the part of your brain that says, hey, wait, don't do this, so that you can just react. So sometimes in the courtroom, I say, look to the person to your right and to your left. Are you thinking about punching them right now? If you are, you're probably not going to do that because you're going to get in trouble. You're going to hurt your hand. You're going to get in a lawsuit. You're going to get charged with assault. And so we break ourselves and we stop ourselves from doing that. But if that person pulled a gun on you, would that immediately change? And it would. You would think, or you would take action without really thinking about what you were doing. You would hide, you would run, you would fight back. In order to do that, you got to shut down the part of your brain that pays attention to consequences. As a result, when people are coming out of these high stress situations, when they have been threatened, when they have been victimized by crimes, they will often say, it happened so fast, or it all felt like a blur. When you have those things happening, that's because they've shut this down. They don't even really remember too clearly what they did. So high stress situations will cause you to pay less attention to these details and make it less likely to clearly remember what happened. This can be a counterintuitive point for jurors because a lot of times people will say, I remember it like it was yesterday. I can still see the look in his eyes. I'll never forget what happened. All of those things. Well, that's probably true. But what's happened is after that event's taken place, you have relived this event again and again. You have reconstructed it in your mind over and over and over again, like PTSD type stuff. It's going to come back over and over. And what the assumption is that you're watching the tape over and over and over again. Realistically, what are you doing? Reconstructing over and over and over again. So each reconstruction is an opportunity to get a little farther away from what actually happened. So you often end up with people who've been in high stress situations who have very clear memories of what happened. They have a lot of details. They have a lot of certainty about being right. But because of the struggles with encoding on the front end and the multiple reconstructions on the back end, there's a decent chance that the version of the story they have ended up with is actually not that accurate at all. So stress, if you can document that it's there, is a really important thing for your case. And usually it's there. They'll say, I was scared. I was panicked. I felt fear for my life. If you've got those things, then they're admitting that they were stressed, and this becomes a factor. Going along with stress is weapon focus. Y'all have probably heard of this before. It's just what it sounds like. If a weapon's being used during the crime, there's a tendency to stare at that weapon instead of the face of the person holding it. So this kind of cuts into duration of exposure. Maybe you were around this person for a minute, but if you were staring at the gun he's holding the whole time, maybe you didn't see his face all that clearly. So this is also difficult to test experimentally because I said we can't simulate armed robberies, but we can show videos in which the person either has a weapon or they're just shaking their fist or something, they're doing very similar things in the two cuts of the video, but one time it's a gun and the other times it's not. Even in that scenario, you see about a 50% reduction in identification accuracy when this is a gun instead of something else. Even when people aren't directly threatened, even though they don't fear for their own life, our eyes are just drawn to the weapon, and that's less time that we can spend looking at the person. So many of these witness statements and offense reports will feature witnesses who are describing the gun much more clearly than the person. And so if you see that happening, at the very least, you can argue some of the very limited time they had to look at this person was spent looking at the gun. We know that because they've described it very clearly. So weapon focus, another very simple thing to check for. If there's a weapon present, they probably looked at it. It's probably going to reduce the reliability of an identification considerably. And then cross-racial ID, you've also probably heard about. If someone's identifying someone of a different race than their own, they're about 1.5 times more likely to be wrong than if they're not. This is true for just about any combination of races. It doesn't matter who's this or who's that. If it is a different race than their own, they are more likely to make mistakes. There's a lot of like sociocultural theories about why this is true. There's not any real clear answers about why it happens, and there don't really need to be, because all we're really focusing on is that it happens. We know that the reliability goes down when identifying someone of a different race. And this is easy to check in any experiment that's being done. You simply look at the race of your suspect and you look at the race of your participant, and you can do quick comparisons. So this is incredibly consistent and well replicated. So that's always a factor to mention. Witness intoxication is the last of the major ones. It's kind of the ultimate estimator variable, because very rarely are you going to do a blood draw on a witness or a victim to see what their BAC was. So in a real case, they're going to say, yeah, I had a couple drinks, and you're never going to be sure how much that was a factor. But if you suspect they've been drinking, if it's 2 a.m. outside of a bar, as it often is, you can at least mention that, hey, if they had been drinking, if they were intoxicated, the evidence shows that the higher the BAC gets, the less reliable the subsequent identification would be. There's some recent research out that suggests if they are below the legal limit for alcohol, it probably doesn't significantly impact their ability to make identification, but I would have some question about how they did this. This research actually occurred by researchers just going into a bar and talking with some people for a while, and then coming back like 15 minutes later and saying, can you pick the person out of the lineup that you just saw? So it's longer exposures, low stress, no crime, all of that stuff. And then after they made the ID, they would measure their BAC. So anyway, there's some drawbacks to any type of research about that, but it's a simple truth that if they are intoxicated, or not even intoxicated, if they have alcohol in the system, alcohol is a depressant drug. It slows down brain functioning at every level. It impacts encoding, storage, and retrieval. And so even a small amount of alcohol in the system is something that's going to make the likelihood of subsequent IDs less reliable. Maybe not dramatically so, but it's enough to mention if you suspect that the witness has been drinking. Okay, so these are often the most important thing. All the research is on, lineup position and photos and all this stuff, and we'll get to that in just a second. But it's often skimmed over in court because it seems obvious. I think that you really have to hammer this stuff because it's the sort of stuff that the jury can't understand. A witness cannot correctly, and I'm underlining correctly, remember something if they didn't encode it in the first place. If it was super dark, if it was 2 seconds long at 75 yards, if the sun was in their eyes, that sort of stuff, those things matter more than you might think. If it's in a moving vehicle with the windows rolled up, how well, there's movement and glare and positioning of the car and all of that stuff. You need to think through all of those things. Something I commonly do whenever I'm working on a case is I'll figure out where this happened. I'll go to Google Street View. I will see, are there street lamps? Are there sources of light? You probably want to send an investigator out there to see just how dark it was, just how far the light would reach, and those sorts of things. So you're moving to the idea that if they couldn't have seen it, it's not possible to make the ID. A case I often think about with this is one in which an ID had been made on a residential street in the middle of the night. I did the Google search, the Street View thing. There were no street lights at all. Any of the light would have just been coming from porch lights that were, 40 or 50 yards away in the middle of the street. The witness had made the identification. The guy had been standing next to a car that was about 6 feet away. They asked them what color was the car that they were standing next to. And they said, I don't know, it was really dark. Now you could say, okay, it's hard to tell the color of a car in low lighting conditions, but that's not what's relevant. What's relevant is they said it was really dark. If it's really dark for that purpose, it's also dark for the purpose of seeing their face. Sometimes jurors just don't put those things together. They assume, well, they remember the face, so it must have been light enough for that. No, they've reconstructed their memory for the face. If they said it was really dark, it was really dark. So sometimes you just need someone to point out the obvious. This was 50 yards away. It was dark of night. How could they have possibly have seen it? And if they have the question, well, they remember it, they must have, then you back up into this idea that memories are not perfect. Okay, so let's go on to the lineup. I'll go a little faster through this because I'm already running out of time. So as I said, most of the research is here, but I think these things often end up being less important for a case. There's been extensive research about how lineups are made. I'm going to skip over the simultaneous versus sequential debate because the Department of Justice said not all that long ago, really either of them are okay. And I've always kind of agreed that this is the case. So I don't even use this as a factor in my analysis of cases anymore, even though there's a pile of research about it, about this deep. And I can talk to you about it if you want to know more about it, but it's really not as much of a factor anymore. Basically, if they remember the person well enough to ID them, they will do that from either approach. If they don't, then you've got problems either way. So it's kind of a non-factor that's been beaten to death. Something that is important that I do spend a lot of time looking at is similarity of the photos. What you're really looking for here is a suspect photo that stands out as obviously different from the others. So the obvious example, if you've got a black suspect and 5 white guys, that's obviously not fair. And I've never seen anything quite that bad. But I have seen people of different races mixed in. I've seen people who were very older or just didn't look anything like them at all. So the goal here is to have 5 fillers who have the same basic description as the suspect. Not looks identical to them, but would be described in the same basic general terms. So it is tricky. It is hard to build a fair lineup. And there's almost always something that you can nitpick at, but ultimately you want to just make sure that there's not something glaringly different about the suspect compared to the others, and that there's no, clear thing that just makes them jump out. So this extends beyond the people themselves to the backgrounds. Often you'll see the suspect has a different background than the others. All 5 of them are against a white wall, and then you got someone standing against something else. Or, you can get into what they're wearing, prison jumpsuit for one, normal clothes for the other 5. I've seen it happen. So it's not just what they look like, it's also kind of the peripherals, the markings on the photos. All of that has to be assessed, and we'll see an example of that in just a second to make sure it's not causing a problem. So there's always something you can get into here. And sometimes it's egregious and sometimes it's just little stuff because it's really hard to build perfect lineups. Blind administration. This is something that just seems to be a challenge for the police. What this would mean is that the police officer giving the photo spread to the witness does not know who the suspect is. What should happen is they should get an officer not involved with the case or the investigation at all, to be the person in the room that reads the instructions, shows them the photo, collects the response, and then they walk out of the room and they give it back to the other guy. If you have an instance where the person who's investigated the case or who has made the lineup themselves is the one showing it to the witness, there's the possibility that they could sort of unintentionally, or maybe intentionally, but most likely unintentionally, sort of lead the witness to identifying the suspect. Body language, tone of voice, not overt things, but the research is out there that if the person giving the photo spread knows who the suspect is, the witness is more likely to pick them than not. That comes from what are called mock witness experiments, where there isn't a crime, nothing has actually happened, but you tell the researcher in the room, hey, it's number 2. We want you to show it to 100 people and see how many people pick number 2. If that person knows it's number 2, more witnesses are going to pick number 2 than if they don't. It's been done. So what you're looking for is a witness that has, or an administrator who has no knowledge whatsoever and will tell the witness that. That's important to say. Now, I don't know who the suspect is. I'm not involved with this case. I'm not going to be able to answer any questions for you. I'm just here to work through this process with you. This is important so that the witness won't look to the police officer for any help or confirmation or anything like that. The best thing a police officer can do after handing the photos over, I think, is to get out of the room or certainly not say anything at all. They shouldn't give them any help or any hints or anything like that. So not knowing who the suspect is guarantees that should happen. And then the proper instructions or admonitions. Witnesses should be explained how this works. They should be given a list of instructions that say, here's what you're doing, here's how you're supposed to approach this. I do a lot of work in Texas. Every city has their own, every county has their own. Sometimes different offices in the major cities even have different ones. And so why we're not all just on the same page with the same uniform form, I don't know. But what you're looking for sure is a statement saying, the true guy may not be here. You shouldn't feel compelled to make an identification. We will continue this investigation even if you don't. That's the basic stuff. Most of them are going to have that. It should say that the administrator doesn't know who the suspect is. If they can't say that, that's a problem. Really, one of the more important things is to say, try not to base the identification on changeable features. So their hair may have changed, their facial hair may be shorter or longer. Try not to even base it on facial expressions. Try to look at things like their eyes and their facial structure that's consistent from one photograph to the next. I've often seen, many police reports that simply say admonitions were given and it's not signed. There's nothing documenting it. It's just, witness identified the suspect. The other thing this admonition sheet should do is clearly document which one was chosen. The witness chose number 3. Here's why they chose it. Here's how confident they were in their decision. It's just rather hit or miss whether you get that or not. But if you don't have those things, there are things that should be there. Really, the only way to know if this was done properly is to see that this was audio or video recorded. And so I would add that here as an expectation. In our era of body-worn cameras, there's really no excuse whatsoever for having not recorded a procedure at all. It is amazing how often it continues to happen that for whatever reason, they've recorded this, they've recorded that, they've done this interview, they've done that interview, but hey, we just somehow forgot to record this. It's almost a red flag at this point if it's not. So seeing this procedure is important. You also get to see what the language use is of the person making the decision. Do they seem confident? Is it clear that they're not confident? There are some other things you can get into there with that. So if they're not recording these procedures, that is a problem. So that's the system variable stuff. Let's apply all of this to the murder case I mentioned before. So what I got into here was this, despite them being there for 2 minutes, they said, yeah, they were there for 2 minutes. Well, a lot of that was a car driving in a circle around a parking lot. After that, they parked and the guy was sitting in a car in the middle of the day. So I said, how well did they see this car sitting there? Was their sun, reflecting off the windshield? Were they at an angle where they could see through the windows, or could they not see through the windows? So even though the guy was there for a while and the witnesses were there for a while, are we sure that they actually could see inside? Latency wasn't an issue because what happened in this case is everybody freaked out, everybody called the police, everybody started talking on the grounds of where this took place, and they all agreed it was this guy they knew who did it. So 3 of them, the 3 that testified in the case, drove down to the police station, and they had all decided on the way that it was this guy that they knew. So that's an issue there. They kind of rendered the lineups irrelevant. We'll get to that in a second. Stress was absolutely documented. We heard some of the 911 calls. As you could imagine, people were freaking out. So they were incredibly just stressed by what had happened. And so that was definitely there as well. There was a possibility for weapon focus, but it happened so quickly, such a quick shooting, that probably it didn't happen. But really one of the things I talked with the attorney about is, just because these people were there doesn't mean that they were staring at this car. They were at a party. There's a bunch of stuff going on. There's a bunch of people around. And so that seemed like a problem in one way, but realistically, they're distracted. They're looking in 1,000 different directions. They probably really didn't look over until they heard the gunshot. And so then they've got the stress involved. Then they've got other things happening. And so it seemed like a slam dunk exposure to the person. Actually, it may not have been. We don't know for sure, but it's not likely that they just stared at him for 2 minutes before he decided to shoot someone. System variables in this case, the lineups were not blind. In this case, both the witnesses and the officer doing the procedure knew who the suspect was. And it wasn't really the police's fault because they had come in and they all said, hey, it's this guy. So there's kind of a non-starter from the beginning. And so what I argued in this case is this should not have been a photo spread case. If all 3 of them know this person and said, this is the guy we saw, why are we showing them photo spreads? They're going to just pick the guy that they know. It's irrelevant. And so this was a case of photo spread IDs being used as bolstering. You'll see that fairly often where they have a case that maybe hasn't quite come together, but they go ahead and do photo spreads because they're supposed to carry all of this weight. If you have an eyewitness who picks the guy out of a lineup, it's supposed to carry a lot of weight. Shouldn't carry any weight in a case like this. This is what I testified to. They've already made the decision. Now, the jury needs to consider that, right? They need to consider that they think that he did it. But just because they picked the guy out of a photo spread when both the officer and the witness knew that's what was going to happen, it adds no new information. And so this was a use of photo spreads that was not appropriate. It's important the jury understand, why are we doing this process in the first place? What are photo spread IDs used for? They are used for cases in which the identifying witness doesn't know the suspect. That is the key. If they have already said they know who did it, shouldn't be doing a photo spread. So they would be using a photo spread because the only means by which they have to make an identification is their visual recollection of what this person looked like. If they have ideas about who did it otherwise and they've already committed to that belief, a photo spread's not the right thing to do. So that's what we argued in this case. Here's the photo spread they used. This guy, I think they got it expunged, so we're not showing his face, but it was an unremarkable lineup. There wasn't anything that really stood out. They all kind of had the same dress. They all had the same general appearance. We didn't even talk about the lineup in trial at all because they'd already decided what they were going to do. So it was an unnecessary thing to even get into. Most cases have a nugget. It's what I always look for, something that kind of causes it to kind of break all this open. And so in this case, it turns out that really the identification was not based on who was in the car, but thinking they recognized the car. And in fact, different people had described the car in different ways. We talked about that before. Was it a black Challenger or a black Charger or whatever? As it turned out, the suspect in this case actually did have two different cars, one of each, a Charger and a Challenger. And so some of them had described him being in one of the cars. Some of them had described him in being in the other of the cars. In fact, in the 911 call, one of the identifying witnesses was initially certain it was a white Charger. And then you can hear a pause on the phone when she's talking to other witnesses. And then she's like, no, it was a black Challenger. So just like that, she updated her recollection of what she saw to match what other people were telling her. It was live reconstruction that we could actually play for the jury. It was kind of a cool moment to see some of this stuff actually happening live. And so how do we know it wasn't a white car? How well did they see any of this happen? That started to just sort of build out, and it made the case that they didn't actually see the suspect do this. They thought he did it, and then they're like, well, this is the car he drives, so that must be the car I saw. So that must be what I saw. One of the witnesses who passed the guy, the car before the shooting happened, even said, I remember seeing a boil on his neck right here. Very compelling testimony for a jury, but she knew the guy. She knew he had a boil on his neck right here. And so if she decides he's the one who did it, she could replay that event in her mind, walking past the person. And now when she walks by, she doesn't see a stranger. She doesn't see a random person. She sees the person she knows. She remembers the boil on the neck. And then you're kind of just expanding out from there. So in this case, we really talked about how the other witnesses became sources of potential misinformation. They all kind of contaminated themselves. They made the decision before they even talked to the police. And so the identifications were irrelevant. This was tracking really well with the jury in both cases before they hung or fell apart for other reasons. So yeah, they all saw the same guy. Not necessarily. They all agreed it was the same guy. They all formed a belief that it was the same guy. And then everything that followed fit what they knew about that person. So that's how we attack this case. Let me show you in the what I have about 7 or 8 minutes, let me show you some of the lineups I've come across that are good, bad, and different. This is one of the worst ones I've ever seen. This actually wasn't from a case that I did. As a colleague of mine shared this. It's not a very good scan. It's kind of hard to see on the screen. The description given by the witness in this case, and I'm going to repeat what they said. This is how they described it. They described the suspect as, quote, a real big old black dude. That was it. And then this was the lineup that was produced. And so this lineup has been shown to thousands of people with that description. And I can tell you that 80 to 90% of them will pick the one in the bottom middle because he is the biggest guy on there by far. If you look at some other things, you can't even see his face all that well. Some of them you can see faces clearly, some you can't, but he's obviously the biggest person in there. And if that's all you're going on, is that there was a big, large dude, you can even notice that the zoom on his photograph is tighter than on the others. His body and face are taking up more of the photograph than are the others. So even a zoom that is not consistent from one photograph to the next can cause a suspect to stand out. So this is a very poor lineup because people who know nothing about the case are still able to pick the suspect. So that is clearly a biased lineup. This is another really bad one for a lot of reasons. Now, ignore the circle that says this is him. That's the witness did that. If the police did that, that would be highly suggestive, right? It's not quite that bad. But obviously you can see here, you can't even see most of their faces. You can't see their eyes. You can't see their mouths or their features at all. And I know this is on a computer screen, but I actually looked at this. The real life product was this bad. And so here you have problems with photographs and just, poor picture quality is a huge red flag. But there's a couple of others here. One is the height background, the scale behind them showing how tall they are. You can see for the suspect that not only is he the tallest one, but he's so tall that you can see the end of the scale and the brick wall above where the scale ends. This clearly suggests to the witness that he's the tallest guy there. But if you want to just look at the numbers, you can see that all of the rest of them, except number 2, are shorter. So that is clearly a problem. If you're looking for similarity, you don't want to have these mixed in sources of variation that can be easily controlled. So just don't take the photos in front of this thing, and you're off to a better start. Another detail that a lot of people miss is at the top of the lineup, it says ICSO lineup. That's the guy's name. So why don't you go ahead and not put the suspect's name at the top of the lineup? This one and the one before it both came from fairly small towns where they didn't have a lot of protocol or procedure for this. So if you are working on a case where these things aren't kind of streamlined, you'll be more likely to run into this kind of stuff. So these are some obvious examples of what make lineups bad. You can't see the faces. The zoom is inconsistent. Suspect stands out for obvious reasons compared to the others. And so these are some of the things you want to look at beyond just what they look like. We didn't really talk at all too much about what they look like. It's just how do these photos make them seem to stand out compared to the others. Now, in contrast, this is a good photo spread. If you are from Texas, you'll recognize these as driver's license photos. And so that's a good choice because it's all the same zoom, all the same background. So you're not going to have any of that stuff that I just talked about. And one of the things I like about this one is that these women don't look identical in any way at all. None of them really look alike, but by and large, they're likely to be described in the same way. With the exception of number 3, who might be younger and might be Hispanic. The others are likely to be described as white women with dark hair, except for number 2, kind of blonde, in their 30s or 40s. And that's good. So I had no quarrel with this lineup whatsoever. If you're looking for how to do it, this is ideal. It's uniform. They're all the same size. They all have the same basic description with a couple of exceptions. This is the right way to do it. And so this is a nice one. So that's everything I just said. I want to quickly run through a couple of other interesting ones I've come across. One of the things you'll get into a lot is what do you do with people who have tattoos? It's a real mess when there are tattoos because no 2 tattoos are the same. You can't find people with similar descriptions and similar tattoos. And so what do you do? It's always a mess. What happened here is, first of all, they put black boxes over the shoulders so the clothing was removed. So prison jumpsuits, any of that stuff, just taken out of the equation. I think they should do that every time because what they're wearing shouldn't matter. They also put the blue bar over their necks to cover neck tattoos because you're usually not identifying someone based on their neck. I'm good with that. I thought that was a great idea as well. And I don't know how well you can see this, but what they actually did is the suspect has teardrop tattoos right here. What they tried to do was take those teardrop tattoos and Photoshop them onto the other 5 guys so that all of them have teardrop tattoos. That was really clever. I thought it was a great effort. I commended them and praised them for doing everything they can to solve kind of a difficult situation. The problem was, if you looked at these closely, you can tell that the photoshopped tattoos are kind of pixelated. They kind of look photoshopped. And this was a case where each photo was on its own sheet of paper. It was blown up pretty big. It's like, hey, it's kind of obvious that these other ones are photoshopped and this one's not. So even when you do the very best you can, you end up with something, and it's fair to point those things out. So don't commit crimes if you have tattoos on your face. It's a real disadvantage. Let me quickly just hit another's because I've used up my time here. This was another murder case that I worked on several years ago. I'm okay with the photo spread being black and white. No problem there. You can pretty much see their faces. So really my only concern with this one is that the top left, the suspect, does not have a number. He's the only one without a number, and that can potentially cause him to stand out. It's a real easy fix. Either write in a number for him or take off the numbers for the other ones. So whatever you're doing, just do it consistently. The witness in this case identified him after 15 months because she said she recognized the shirt that he was wearing. So that's getting back to, we don't make IDs based on shirts. There's that assumption, oh, they must have arrested him the same night. That shirt looks about right. obviously the photo was not taken the night the crime was committed. So that paired with some other weaknesses in the case, this one ended up getting thrown out. And I don't want to say anything about this one. Oh, here's what I want to mention about this one, and then I will wrap up because I've used my time. Again, you got driver's license photos here. Nothing particularly wrong with this photo spread. It's decent. But the witness in this case mentioned that she recognized his buggy eyes. So you can kind of see how the guy identified there has, I don't know, rounder or wider eyes around the outside, whatever you want to call that. His eyes are kind of popping out a little bit. That's great, but she never mentioned that before. If she had described someone as having this feature before, okay, but now it's kind of popping up as a reason he stands out, that had not been previously identified. So there was that, and there was the fact, and I'll end with this. This witness was looking at these, and she looked at these and she said, I think it's this one. She's like, the others don't even come close to the man I saw in my house. So the officer said, okay, so you think it's this one. I'm going to count them out for you. So you're selecting number 4. Is that correct? It was a case of the witness had ruled out the other 5, and therefore the officer said, okay, you've ruled out the other 5. It must be number 4. You got to keep in mind that photo lineups are not multiple choice questions where there's always a correct answer. Eliminating 5 doesn't mean you've selected the 6th. Sometimes witnesses think that way, but when police officers go ahead and encourage them to do that, like, okay, you've eliminated 5, so you're picking number 4. No, he completely botched the procedure by having that interaction with her. Up until that point, he had done a great job. But basically, once they start talking to themselves, you don't need to talk back because you're going to end up saying something like this, and that can be somewhat prejudicial. So to sum up, I ran out of time at the end, but I think I made it. Almost all ID cases are going to have limited duration and latency as factors. There's going to be darkness or a quick exposure or distance or something that's in play, and it's going to take at least a day to get this done. And you're going to see most of the forgetting occurring within that first day. You've almost always got stress. Weapon focus is common. Cross-racial is common. Stress, cross-racial, and weapon focus each reduce identification accuracy by about 50%. So if you've got any or all of those things, you've got a limited duration, and you've got a passage of time prior to the ID taking place, it really is kind of a non-starter. There's definite lack of reliability from those things. If you see a procedure that hasn't been recorded, it certainly should have been. You can raise questions as to why. Officers should not be interacting with the witnesses while they make their decision, or they'll make a mistake like we just saw. And then got to make sure that the suspect doesn't stand out as much as possible. I didn't really talk about field IDs or show-ups or too much. That's probably a different talk. But again, the goal there with field IDs or show-ups is to try to remove as much suggestion from the procedure as possible. Try to say, just because we've caught this guy and he's standing in front of the police car, that doesn't mean he did it. You can't really convince them to not think that way. But they should still be told someone else might have done it. We'll continue this investigation even if you don't make an ID. Okay, I am at the end of my presentation. I don't see any questions in the question window, but if there are any of those that want to pop in, I'm happy to catch those.
Thank you, Trent. Like Trent said, if you have questions and you'd like to submit them, you can go ahead and click the Q&A button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. Now, it looks like we have a few questions, so I'll go ahead and go through those. Thank you again for that wonderful presentation, Trent. Our first question is, how can I effectively explain the concept of memory reconstruction to a jury without sounding overly academic?
Yeah, it's overly academic, maybe the hard part. I would honestly say, not to toot my own horn or the horn of people like me, but have me do it. Bring in an expert to talk about it so that we can sound overly academic. And one of the things that you can do is you can try to work to build a direct exam that's not that is kind of more layman's terms, that is kind of more daily examples. I kind of got into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of encoding, storage, retrieval, all of that stuff. But just talking about some of the basic studies that show that witnesses can make mistake. Loftus's study from 1972, where she crashed the two cars together, is a classic, where people got the car color wrong and they saw broken glass when there wasn't any glass. And they misestimated the speed dramatically depending on the wording of the questions. Talking through an experiment like that can make it a little more accessible. And so I don't know. Honestly, I think understanding memory is one of the less academic things that you're going to have to get into. I mean, compared to other forensics like DNA or ballistics or fingerprints, I mean, good grief, no one understands that. I think really the challenge with what I do and with this issue is that everyone thinks they understand it. Everyone uses their memory every day. They're like, well, I know how this works, and so it's almost Mythbusters. And so I don't know that it's an academic concern. I do think it's just that you're challenging what people think they know about how the world works. So basic case examples or experimental examples are probably a good way to do that if you want to stay away from all the technical terms. So that's what I would recommend. Get the basics in and then talk through a couple of experiments that show just how it works or doesn't work.
Awesome. Thank you, Trent. That leads nicely into our next question, which is more so, I know you mentioned studies and referencing those, but this person asked specifically about analogies or visuals that you think might be helpful in showing how unreliable memory can be to jurors.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a ton of them, and probably the best way to do it, and I don't know that you can do this in a courtroom, is to do a micro experiment or a mini experiment and just kind of demonstrate, let's all try to remember this and let's see how mistaken we are. If you're aware of Simon and Shabers's study, I actually talk about it in my other talk for Justia, where they have the gorilla walk through the scene and no one notices it. You could probably play that in the courtroom if that's admissible and say, all right, how many of you saw this? It's a real quick hands-on way to show them, man, people miss things that are right in front of their eyes all the time. But I don't do it often, but if an attorney was interested in it, I do think, you could take some pretty simple bar graphs from some of these studies and just say, in this condition, correct retrieval was this, and in this condition, it was this. Correct ID rate was here, correct ID rate was there. I've never really been asked to do that, but those stats and data are in the studies that I'm talking about. And so turning those into a visual, I think, it's a pretty powerful shortcut. And so that would be there as well, just to say, look at this big drop from condition A to condition B. Yeah, it's the data is there. And so if someone wanted that, I could put that together pretty easily.
Awesome. Thank you, Trent. That's great insight. Our last question that we have time for today is, I know you touched on this a little bit, but this person asks about common misconceptions that jurors have about eyewitness testimony. What would you say those misconceptions are?
Yeah, I think ultimately the issue is that most jurors are not assessing what I'm talking about. They're assessing credibility. And so there is a tendency to conflate, not just in the mind of jurors, but from the state's perspective as well, to conflate credibility with reliability. This person is honest. This person is telling the truth. Why would they lie? They seem very confident. They seem very certain about these other details. Therefore, their memory must be correct. And so I think I don't know that that's a misconception, but it is just a perception of why would they lie? That's kind of always the thing that we're up against. Why would they lie? Why would they make this up? Why would they not tell the truth? They are telling the truth. That's exactly what they're doing. I'm doing delayed outcry for Justia in a month. Come back then. We really get into that there. Why would this child make up these accusations that are not true? They're not making them up. They do believe they're true. They are just potentially mistaken. And so to concisely answer the question, I think the biggest misperception is that if the memory exists, it has been found. It has been opened like a box that was stored in the attic, and what's in there is correct and true. Getting them to understand that they can access and create and share the memory truthfully and still be mistaken, that is the hard part. So I do think, and I teach memory, to students every year. It's all I do, right? I do think people get it, that memory can fail, that memory is not perfect, that they can forget things. But I think the biggest myth is that the only way that memory can fail is to forget. It's hard to get them to realize that memory can fail in the midst of remembering, that there can be false memories. I heard from a state psychologist less than a year ago. This is someone testifying for the state in criminal trials who said they had never heard of false memories, which, okay, you've curated your knowledge pretty carefully if you've never heard of false memories. And then they got back to us and they were like, oh, okay, I guess those are real, comma, but I don't think it applies to this case. So that is the other thing. It's like, okay, maybe you can't remember lists of words or you can't remember something in an experiment, but surely you would remember the person who attacked you or the person. So significance is going to lead to better accuracy, or an emotionally relevant event is going to be better remembered. There is evidence that emotionally better events are remembered, but are they remembered accurately? Just because you have the memory and you saved it and you've got it doesn't mean that it's correct. So those misconceptions, if it's there, it's true. If it was an emotionally relevant event, it's more likely to be accurate than another. The research shows just the opposite. Actually, traumatic events are less likely to be correctly remembered because of how often they're reconstructed, because of stress at time of encoding. And so those are the misconceptions. It's just, can you convince them of that in 5 minutes? That's the uphill push. But so I'll end where I started. Get someone like me in the room who can come in and, just rely on my experience and how long I've been doing this to try to explain it.
Well, thank you so much, Trent, for all of that insight and answer audience questions. I do want to thank you all so much for joining us for another Justia webinar. Before you go, don't forget that upgrading to Justia Connect Pro gives you that access to CLE credit opportunities just like this one through live and on-demand webinars, so you can stay informed and meet all of your requirements. Plus, Pro members enjoy enhanced directory profiles, and AI-powered Justia chat to help you capture more leads, and exclusive discounts on Justia marketing solutions. To take full advantage of these benefits or just explore what they might be for you, you can go to pro.justia.com. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you again, Trent, for joining us again. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next video.